Hi, welcome to MMT Mondays on Real Progressives. I'm Jeff Ginter, your host. So last week we had part one of what I consider to be a fairly famous episode of Real Progressives with Ellis Winningham and Steve Grumbine, basically going through MMT 101, soup to nuts. What is MMT? What are the implications of understanding the reality of how our monetary system actually operates? And there's a reason that this is such an important conversation, and it's so that we can save lives. Literally, whatever policy prescription you may have for whatever's ailing you, I guarantee you it's not going to be a difficult conversation to have with people to get them to agree that yes, we should be doing this. Yes, of course, this would be, in a perfect world, of course we would be doing X, Y, Z. I mean, of course! But it's just so expensive. How could we possibly raise the revenue? We shall have to tax the rich. And then nothing ever happens. Convincing people that we need these policies, whatever the policies happen to be, that's the easy part. Telling them how we can go about doing that is the hard part, because they think you need to tax and borrow to finance these things. You have to look for the money. And so nothing happens. Because the very idea of looking for the money is a real question of who's going to pay. Every time they ask, how are you going to pay for that? That's not the real question they're asking. What they're really asking is, who's going to pay? It's you, isn't it? Yeah, you're going to pay. Yeah, you want to get single-payer health care? Good luck with that, pal. You're already taxed into the Stone Age. You won't be able to pay over anymore. Oh, sure, you'll have health care, however good it be. But you won't have any money left over. Government's going to come taking it all away from you. And people who would therefore otherwise agree that we should have single-payer health care sit down and they shut up. And they actually get angry when people suggest that we should actually have single-payer health care because they're afraid that it's going to be their wallets that are going to be picked. So these people need to be educated. If you need to yell at them, yell at them. If you need to hold their hand, hold their hand. So know your audience. Know when it's time to hit them. Know when it's time to talk sweet to them. But talk to them all the time. Do whatever it takes, short of violence, to be able to get these ideas across. Don't worry. It's only the lives of every living being on the planet. Don't worry about it. Enjoy Ellis and Steve. We'll be back at the end.
Eric asks a great question. This is one of the early questions I used to have when I was trying to get hold of this stuff before I grokked it. And he says, what happens when people take $9,995, stuff it in their mattress, or spend it in another country? And more people do that.
So
the concept of leakages.
it's a demand leakage.
Yes.
And we'll get to that when we get to the sectoral balances. By the time we get there, Eric will go, oh, that's obvious. Yeah, because it's called a demand leakage. In other words, we'll get to that, but overall what he's talking about is what we call a demand leakage. And that is when people say, if you are not spending and you're sticking your money under a mattress or you're sticking it in a bank account and not spending it or whatnot, or sticking it under the seat in the back seat of your car, okay, you're not spending it, so you're leaking demand from the economy. Okay? Government even encourages demand leakages, believe it or not, through tax advantage, like an individual retirement account, believe it or not, is a demand leakage. It's government encouraged demand leakage. In other words, the government is saying, save your money in an IRA so we can have some unemployment. And you do it. All right? And we'll get to why saving results in unemployment too. But anyway, we got the cash. So basically, quick review, like I said, cash is based on bank customer demand for the item. And when you demand it, the Fed will simply convert the numbers that were in reserve accounts into physical cash and send them to your bank, and your bank will hold them in their vault instead of their reserve account. And that's it. Nothing else to it. There's no printing money to fund spending. Doesn't work anymore. Doesn't happen. Not the gold standard. Not the year 1920.
No, very good. All right, so Ellis, let's take the next step for this in particular, and that is what backs our currency. What makes our currency have value at all?
Tax. Tax. The federal tax. The federal government taxes. Therefore, you demand it. Therefore, it's valuable. And so you say, why is it valuable? Well, I don't want to go to prison. So it's quite valuable to me to have. That way I can pay my taxes. Okay. In the second instance, though, and it's something that we're going to talk about when we get to the fundamental rule of macroeconomics, the idea is that tax creates a certain value, okay? But the real value is the goods and services with which you can use a dollar to buy, okay? In other words, food has value, cars have value, toothpaste has value, shoes have value, okay? So many people forget about the things that they can buy with a dollar and only worry about the dollar. And they want it to have intrinsic value, okay? They want it to have intrinsic. They want it to have gold pegged to it so that it has some intrinsic value, like my $1 is worth an ounce of gold. Okay, so your $1, which is worth 1 ounce of gold, can also buy an apple. Why does it need to be worth an ounce of gold then? Okay, it's just a waste of time. But look. Since the gold standard ended, you and everybody here in America has been buying apples, oranges, toothpaste, gasoline, tires, oil changes, and whatever with fiat US dollars that have nothing pegged to it. And when you ask them, what's the current dollar value of the dollar? They go, they don't know. But yet it's buying them things, all right? That's the point. From the private sector's perspective, it's what the money can buy, not the money itself. The money is infinite, okay? I can't state that enough. The US dollar is issued by the government, and it has infinite capacity to issue these dollars, the tax credits. Look at them as vouchers if you want, okay? They're just something that's man-made, that's created from the government. It just spits out from the government, which it spends into existence. It can do this infinitely. There is a barrier that would prevent it from doing so. But if it chose, it could just spend beyond that barrier if you wanted. We'll talk about that later. But the point is, there's nothing, there's no hard financial limit to how much the US government can issue. It can just spend into existence $6 quadrillion, Mark, if it wanted to. Okay? Because that's how it buys things. It spends dollars into existence. But like I said, there is a limit, and we'll talk about that in a little bit when we get to the macroeconomics side of this. Yeah.
Very, very good, sir. All right.
Yeah. So the point being is that it's not the money. It's what we can buy with the money. And I hate using the word money, but, you know, it's such a familiar term with everybody. You know, in the United States, you got any money? What we're talking about are dollars, aren't we? Okay, you got any dollars? Okay. Well, it's not the dollar itself, but what you can buy with the dollar is what's important. The dollar is infinite. It's not a scarce commodity that you dig out of the ground and pan out of streams. Okay? As much as the Democratic Party would like you to believe that. And as much as the Republican Party would like you to believe that in times when the Democratic Party is in trouble. The dollar is scarce all of a sudden, you know. But it's not. It's not a commodity.
I want to say one thing real quickly. You know, there's a million story of the days out there. There's a million what if scenarios that somebody posits about this or that or the other. None of them are solutions. None of them provide you any hope. All of them are just something to read like a good Hardy Boys novel or maybe a Tom Clancy novel. Not one of them actually solves you and I or our problems. Not one of them fuels or funds a political revolution. Not one of them actually gets you single payer. Not one of them fixes the environment. Not a single one of them helps your children go to college. Not a single one of them. So when I see people throwing, well, what about Libya and what about Iran and what about Russia and the gold standard? What about this and that and the other? I say to you this, if you want to live in sleuth blogosphere, that might be fun to read it like, smoke a bowl, put the candle on and pretend like you're listening to old 1920s radio. But this is real stuff we're giving you here to actually activate the revolution. The stuff Bernie Sanders said, the stuff Jill Stein said, they are the reasons real progressives exist. Not for the people, not Jill or Bernie, but for their platform. You can't get any of it, not an ounce of it, without understanding the economics we're teaching, which is why it befuddles me that conspiracy theories get so much viewership and so much enjoyment when the reality is that they're a stay stuck storyline, and we're providing you a get out of jail, collect 200, get everything you ask for storyline that is verifiable and true, and yet we want to focus on the things we have no control over, that we can only play games with, that we could sit there and flail about on camera and make a lot of stories up, but not a one of them gets you anything for a political revolution. Not a single healthcare bill, not a single education bill, not a single paid family and medical leave bill, and not a single, literally not a single life saved as it goes for fixing the environment. So you can stay stuck pursuing conspiracies that help fuel your excitement as you hit your next bong hit, or you can choose to be in the victory and be a real revolutionary and learn how to hold Congress accountable so that we actually get the things we claim we want. That's what this show is about. That's what Real Progressives is about. And sadly, I think people are more intrigued with folly, with the struggle, without learning the truth, than they are to actually making change happen. And that, my friends, is a very, very sad statement about our so-called movement. So for those who really want this movement to succeed, may I suggest you take the cotton out of your ears, put it right here, and listen, take good notes, and be ready to activate on this with your congressmen, your senators, your local representatives, whoever it takes to change the world, one person at a time, each one teach one. So anyway, Ellis, let me give it back to you, sir. I just needed to say that.
Sure. You having problems with trolls today?
Not really trolls, just I want to make sure that people understand the purpose here is not to answer every possible conspiracy out there. The goal here is to educate you on economics.
Yeah, the point is just to ignore the conspiracies and focus on the reality, learning the reality,
Absolutely.
and then activate activism, like, going to the congressman and saying, look, I know how the system works. I'm not tolerating this anymore. I mean, if you want a conspiracy theory, shit. One of the biggest ones so far has been pulled over your eyes since 1971. I guess we want to call it a conspiracy theory. I don't call it a conspiracy. I just call it a conspiracy of stupidity, or misinformation or whatever. But the point being is that if you like drama, okay, you got plenty of drama with congressmen lying to you on a regular basis about where dollars come from and how the economy works. Right? Trickle down is a good example of a lie. Don't let anyone tell you that MMT is trickle down, because they don't know what they're talking about. And in fact, they don't even understand trickle down economics. Okay, so before we move on to bank lending, which will be past sectoral balances here, we're going to talk about the fundamental rule of macroeconomics, because this is where we're going to bring macroeconomics into this. Because what we know so far is the US government issues the US dollar. It has an infinite issuance capacity. And when it spends those dollars into existence every single time the government spends. To buy something or to give a dollar to somebody, it's a brand new dollar. No tax dollars are involved. Taxes are destroyed. Okay? That's federal taxes. Okay? Now that we understand that, and we understand that when Treasury spends, the Federal Reserve makes sure, stands ready to make sure those payments are going to clear. Okay, so we got all that. So now let's get to the macroeconomics of this. Because remember what we said at the beginning? When the government taxes, it creates people who are unemployed. It causes people to go looking for paid work. All right? So government controls the unemployment rate. Let's find out how mass unemployment occurs. It's actually very simple. The mainstream will have you believe that it's very complex. But as I've told you before in another program long ago, the mainstream's explanations have to be complex and confusing to be believed. All right? I'm just going to give you the straight dope. The straight dope is because the US government is the monopoly issuer of the US dollar. Okay? And that's the only place you can get a dollar. And because people are paid in dollars when they work, the government has total control. It controls the unemployment rate through its net spending. The fundamental rule of macroeconomics, let us never forget this, is that somebody's spending is somebody's income. There is no way around this reality. If Steve Grumbine has $10,000, there's that number again, and I have zero, and Steve looks at me and says, Ellis, here, you can have $10,000. Okay, once he gives that to me, he spent that. Okay, and that 10,000 becomes my income. So he spent 10,000, and that 10,000 became my income. If Steve wants to buy my car for $1,000, I give him the car, he gives me the $1,000. He spent $1,000, I earned $1,000. Whenever you spend money and give it to somebody else for any reason whatsoever, somebody's spending is going to be somebody's income. So what does this mean? Well, I'm erasing this, so I hope you wrote this down. Here we go. On one hand, you have consumers. Consumers are you and me and everybody else in the nation. You know, even CEOs. That's right. Even CEOs and Bill Gates. Bill Gates is a consumer. Every one of us as individual citizens are a consumer. We buy food, we buy toothpaste, we buy shoes. Yeah? Okay, great. And over here, on the other side, you have business. All right. Consumers over here, business over here. Now, what's important to understand here about somebody's spending and somebody's income is that business offers goods and services for sale to consumers. Okay? But just because a product exists does not mean it creates demand. Okay? So we need to ask ourselves the question, what is consumer demand? This is very important for you to understand. Consumer demand is not wishful thinking. In other words, here's an iPhone. Okay, there it is. It's an iPhone 7. Picture of my wife on it. All right, there's an iPhone 7. Apple manufactures these. But just because Apple manufactures these, it does not mean that because it's consumers, there are consumers out here looking at Apple and saying, oh my God, I would love to have an iPhone 7. That's not demand. Just because they want it doesn't mean that that's demand. Now, they have to actually complete the purchase and buy it. That's demand. When consumers spend, that is demand. Okay? And that places pressure on business. So I'm getting rid of this divider line here. Consumers' spending habits cause business to react. As consumers increase their spending, business income increases. Remember what we said? Somebody's spending, somebody's income? Can't say it enough. When consumers spend, that becomes business income. If they spend on aggregate, consumers, meaning all consumers on the whole, on aggregate, increase their spending, business income will increase. But guess what? That also places an increased pressure. It puts more pressure on business to increase its production. That's to increase its output. So if suddenly Apple was selling, say, 1 million iPhones a month, and then all of a sudden consumer spending increased substantially to the point where it started selling 10 million iPhones a month, Apple would say, oh God, we've got to make more iPhones. So you see, it's going to have to increase its output. How does it do that? How does business increase its output? It does that by hiring more workers. See, labor, which I spell with you. So when consumers increase their spending, this is increased business income, but it also increases the pressure on business to produce. And the way it does that is it hires more workers. It puts an ad in the window and says, help wanted. It's asking for help from workers. Please come work for me so that I can meet this consumer demand. Because these damn consumers are spending more and more money. And yeah, my income's going up, but I can't keep up with that demand unless I hire more workers. If you haven't figured out yet, that's how jobs are added. That is how jobs are added in the economy. You ever say, well, we want to add about 135,000 jobs this month right here. We want to add 100,000 jobs. Okay, well, what they're saying is that consumer spending is increased sufficiently to the point where business has hired 135,000 extra people. Okay, but what are consumers spending, Stephen? Oh, good God, U.S. dollars. And where does the U.S. dollar come from? It comes from the U.S. government, Article 1, Section 8. All right? So as consumers spend their U.S. dollars, business income increases. And if that, as we said, that consumer spending is increased persistently, this will cause business to need to beg people to come work for them, and jobs will be added. So how do consumers get more U.S. dollars? Well, they get them from the government when the U.S. government deficit spends. When the U.S. government is deficit spending, it is adding dollars to the economy. It is increasing the number of dollars available to consumers. So what it's doing is, as the U.S. government deficit spends and it injects more dollars into the economy, consumers who want to save, okay, they notice that the pressure on the savings is reduced. They don't have to like buckle down and tighten their belt. They can let loose the belt, okay? It's Thanksgiving dinner. Let my belt loose here. And guess what they do? They begin spending. And as long as consumers can protect how much money they want to save, how many dollars they want to save at all times, they will continue to spend. See? And as consumers spend those dollars, business income increases and job additions increase. In other words, the U.S. government controls the unemployment rate through deficit spending. If the deficit is too low, there aren't enough dollars in the economy necessary to maintain employment levels, and unemployment begins to rise. Why? Because, back to the consumers again. We'll use a C for consumers to save time, and business over here. When consumers reduce their spending on aggregate, business income not only falls, because somebody's spending is somebody's income. So if consumers aren't spending, business is losing income. But most importantly, as it relates to jobs, the demand for increased output has stopped, and now demand for output is also dropping. So guess what business does? It notices that it's losing dollars, it's losing income. There's no more extra production needs. Consumers are not spending enough anymore. So they've got extra workers. Guess what they do with those workers, Stephen? They lay them off.
And they're now destitute.
And guess what happens? The unemployment rate, which we'll call UR, rises. And the reason why is because the federal government, which is over here, this square up here, is not deficit spending enough dollars into the economy to take pressure, sufficient pressure off of consumer savings, allowing them to spend, to place an increased demand on business, to increase its production, to hire more workers. So if you want full employment, you need adequate deficit spending. Isn't that neat? So yes, the government does control the unemployment rate. It is the only entity that creates unemployment and can eliminate unemployment because it's the monopoly issuer of the currency that business uses to pay workers and consumers use to buy goods. And it controls that unemployment rate through net spending, or what we call deficit spending. Now, we remember that I said at the beginning of this segment here about the fundamental rule. We said that government itself injects the dollars through deficit spending, and then those dollars, available dollars, begin to rise in the domestic economy. We analyze this through a thing called the sectoral balances. It's not that difficult. I've done a show on this before, and you may have seen a lot of my posts or a lot of my blog posts or written work or whatnot discussing the sectoral balances. We're only going to show you the equation so that I can divide the economy into 3 sections, what we call sectors, so that you can see the flow of dollars, where they originate and how they leave the economy and how they flow around and create unemployment and create all sorts of problems. And you'll also be able to see why Bill Clinton was wrong in 1999 when he ran a surplus. And you'll be able to see why the Australian government is wrong by trying to pursue this stupid surplus. Doesn't work. Okay. You'll also see why a balanced budget amendment is suicide, and it won't work, right? And we can see that through the sectoral balances. So let's begin this section. Is this your favorite section, Stephen, or what?
It is, in my opinion, the most important light bulb moment next to understanding the difference between states and the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
Those 2 things are maybe the biggest light bulb moments there are to have as a young person learning MMT for the first time.
Yeah. Well, what we're going to do here is we'll refer people that are new to the video that I did on sectoral balances, that one show that we did, where we talked about deriving the equation, so they can see how we derive the sectoral balances equation. They can just go ahead and look at that. That way it'll save a bit of time. And then I'll just begin with the equation and describe the various sectors and what the variables mean. And then we'll get these people clicking them light bulbs on before you know it here. It should be really simple. So what the sectoral balances does, we basically look at 3 basic sectors. Okay, there's 3 sectors to any economy. Okay, they're the government sector, the domestic private sector, and then the foreign sector, or what we call the external sector. That's the rest of the world. All right. And we denote the government sector, the currency issuer, as G minus T. Okay? And the equation looks like this. Equals S minus I minus X minus M. All right, to explain, don't be afraid of this if you're new. It's not hard. This is the government sector, this is the domestic private sector, and this is the external sector, or the foreign sector. G is government spending, T is taxation. Simple, yeah? S is savings, I is investment, X is exports, and M is imports. Okay, so government spending minus taxation equals savings minus investment minus exports minus imports. All right, that's the sectoral balances equation with the currency issuer at the head. What this particular form of the equation shows us is that whatever the government sector deficit spend will be found somewhere in these 2 sectors, which we call the non-government sector when we aggregate them. We put them together. The domestic private sector and the foreign sector together comprise the non-government sector, and this is the government sector. Okay. So, if government spending is greater than that which it taxes away and destroys, you have a deficit, okay? And however much that deficit is, however big that deficit is, those dollars will be found somewhere in the non-government sector deposited. So, in other words, a $1 trillion deficit equals, to the penny, down to the last penny, a $1 trillion surplus for the non-government sector. So, if the US government deficit spends $1 trillion, that will equal a $1 trillion surplus for the non-government sector. Or, going back to the fundamental rule one more time, don't want to forget it, the fundamental rule of macroeconomics, somebody's spending is somebody's income. So that means that federal deficit spending is income for the private sector. Bill Clinton made a mistake. In 1999, Bill Clinton made a mistake, I think. He made a mistake. Yes, he did. He made a mistake. He ran a surplus. Oh, God. Why would he do that? Well, you know, they want to pay down the debt, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, right. No debt. And, you know, we haven't even addressed that yet, but we will. Because when I get done with sectoral balances, then we can move into debt.
There you go.
But because, no, this could have flown straight from that. Because the question is, what do these foreign companies who sell us their goods do with those dollars there? Oh, goodness. So we better wait till the sectoral balances are over. Right now, what we know is dollars come from government and taxes aren't funding spending. We haven't talked about borrowing, haven't talked about national debt, but we're going to. It's coming. Let's understand this first. So one more time. A $1 trillion federal deficit is equal to the penny a $1 trillion surplus, and the reverse is also true. A $1 trillion federal surplus is equal to the penny a $1 trillion deficit for the non-government sector. So, in other words, federal deficit spending is income for the private sector, okay? And a federal surplus is the savings of the private sector. Or, in other words, it's taking away and eliminating its income and then begins digging into its savings. Let's see how it does that. I'm going to draw some boxes because I like squares. Everybody who knows me knows I like squares. So here's the first square. All right, and here's the second square. This is a big one here. I like doing this, you know that? Putting these little connectors on it. I don't want to put this big rectangle over here. Actually, they're rectangles, they're not squares. Gives a shit, right? Okay, so over here, in this box, this will be the government sector. So I'm going to put G minus T here. And over here, this is us, you and me, the domestic private sector, S minus I, okay? And over here is the foreign sector, X minus N. All right. So up here, we've got the federal government. This is the US domestic economy. And over here is the rest of the world. That's everybody else outside of the US, including the government of Russia. I couldn't resist. So anyway, all right. This includes China, Russia, Vladimir Putin, small people and tall people both in Belarus and in Germany and whatnot. Everybody outside of the US, right here. Okay, exports minus imports. This is the US domestic economy, US government. Now, as the US government begins deficit spending, it is the source of US dollars. So in order for it to leave dollars in the economy for you and I, for consumers to use and buy things with, it has to have a deficit. Because if it spends $4 trillion and then taxes $4 trillion, that's zero. So it leaves nothing. Okay? If it did that for the last 200 and some years of its existence, there'd be no dollars in the economy. All right, so as the US government begins deficit spending, what it's doing is the deficit, G minus T, is greater than zero. Okay? That means that the result of government spending minus taxation is greater than zero. That means there's deposits going on. So, as the government deficit spends into the US domestic economy, it is depositing and leaving dollars in the economy for Steve Grumbine and all consumers to use to buy things, okay? And for us to pay employees, all sorts of things. And as it deficit spends, the dollars in the domestic private sector begin to rise. Because, you know, we're a big saving community, aren't we? We're a nation of savers. So look here, it's all going up. Let's say the dollar level is about right here. Okay. Now the government stops deficit spending. It's filled the US economy up to here. Let us assume also that this meets the savings desire of the entire domestic private sector. This is the exact amount of dollars that the domestic private sector wants to save. Thank God. Isn't that wonderful? Everybody's happy. There's lots of jobs. Everybody's prospering. Now, all of a sudden, we noticed that in the 1980s, something happened. Okay? In the 1980s, something happened. Suddenly, we began importing far more than we were exporting. So what does that mean? I urge you to ignore anything that you've heard from the mainstream or from television, because I'm going to show you what it means. What it means is simple. It means that U.S. consumers who were once spending their U.S. dollars buying Fords and Chevys are now buying BMWs and Porsches. They're buying imports. So what U.S. consumers do is they go to work and they earn their dollars, and then they go and buy a BMW. And those dollars, as they buy more imports, and they go to Walmart and buy Chinese food, Chinese goods and stuff. The dollars transfer from U.S. residents' hands to non-U.S. residents' hands. Over here to the foreign sector, And so the foreign sector's accumulation of dollar savings starts to rise, starts to go up, okay? But you'll notice now that the available dollars in the U.S. domestic economy have dropped significantly, see? Because they're going to buy imports. Dollars are flowing into foreign hands. They're not leaving the country. They're remaining, most often they stay at the Federal Reserve, okay? They're just changing hands because somebody's spending in somebody's income. A U.S. resident is giving it to someone who's not a U.S. resident, and they're saying, oh, thank you. And the reason why is because they want U.S. dollars. They want to save in U.S. dollars. If they didn't, they wouldn't be selling you their BMWs and Porsches, okay? They wouldn't be selling you their imported goods. They wouldn't export their goods to you, all right, so that you could buy them. So the dollars in the domestic economy here, S minus I, they begin to drop. And when that happens, what happens? Consumers don't have enough dollars to spend. And so there's getting some pressure on their savings. They got to save. So they cut their spending. Well, if they cut their spending, then unemployment's going to go up because people are going to lose jobs. What do we talk about? Somebody's spending somebody's income. If consumers decrease their spending, business income falls, right? And demand on business for production falls. And so they shed excess workers and unemployment rises. So then the government does something even stupider. It sits there and it says, while all of these dollars are flowing out to buy imports, we're also going to let some go out with taxation. See? Taxes. Big no-no. The government taxes some of those dollars away. And now, way down. The dollars in the tank have dropped significantly. Right? There's not enough dollars in the domestic economy to keep unemployment from skyrocketing. So you got dollars going out to foreign hands through purchasing imports, and you got dollars leaving through taxation. And they're not going to the government. They're literally being destroyed. It's like opening the drain at the bottom of the sink and just letting it spill, letting the water out, and off it goes down the pipe. Never seen again. And that's what happens to those dollars. All right. So the only safe thing that the government can do when a nation is importing far more than it's exporting, as we can see the U.S. is doing, is to fill this spending gap. See that spending gap there? That bar was way up here. Now it's not here. So we'll put the bar where it was. Look at that. Look at how many dollars are missing. This huge red area. We need dollars. We need dollars. Now fill that spending gap. All right. So what we do is we tell the government, well, it has to deficit spend. And it says, righto, and it begins deficit spend. And filling that tank back up, filling the domestic economy back up with more dollars. And when it does that, employment will then rise again. Job additions will rise again, and everything will be happy. And if it stops taxing so damn much, and no, we're not talking about taxing the rich. We're not talking about tax breaks for the rich. We're talking about taxing everybody, especially working class and middle class people. All right, taxes are too damn high for those workers and for middle class people. And they're consumers too. It reduces their spending power. All right. So it doesn't matter if a rich person buys an apple or a poor person buys a damn apple at Walmart. Okay, whether it's a rich man buying an apple at Walmart or a poor person. His spending, that person's spending, rich or poor, is going to ensure that some poor person doesn't lose their job. End of story. That's how the economy works. So if we cut the taxes on the working class, they can keep more of what they earn. Everybody's happy. And dollars can safely flow out into foreign hands. And as long as the government is deficit spending to meet the net savings desires of the domestic private sector, there's always going to be enough dollars. In other words, the government is like a faucet. It looks down at the sink basin and it says, oh, well, there's too much water has leaked out, so it turns on the faucet and fills the sink back up. And then as it leaks out, it fills it up again. Making sure to keep it constantly full. Okay? That's how you maintain the economy when a nation is importing more than it's exporting. All right. Now we're getting to the danger. We're getting to the danger zone here. We're going to have to talk about the national debt. Oh, God. Help. I can't bear it. The national debt. Notice that these foreign entities are earning US dollars. Why? Because somebody's spending is somebody's income. In other words, what these companies like BMW and Porsche did was they shipped their production to the US and then they sold them for US dollars. Currency that's not German currency. Yeah. It's US currency. Why would they do that? Because they want to save in US dollars. They like the idea. Okay, great. So basically what that means, before we get any further, what that means is exports are actual benefit, are actual costs, and imports are actual benefit. Okay? It's the reverse of what the mainstream tells you. And the reason why is because people in Germany and people in China are working really hard, taking their production that they could be consuming themselves, okay, and shipping it to the US and letting us enjoy it. And all they get in exchange is what Moses says is paper bank statement. Ooh. Wow. So we get their production, we get to consume it and enjoy it, and they get a bank statement. Yes, and a bank statement denominated in a currency that's not theirs. That leads us to a question. What do they do with the US dollars then? Well, they could spend them in the US. Okay. Or they could save them. What's one way to save them? You could buy treasury bonds. Oh, no. They could buy treasury bonds. What does that mean now? Does that mean that treasury bonds are savings accounts? Yes, they are. Yeah. You see, when foreign nations like China, since China's the big scare today, it used to be Japan, but since China, we'll talk about China. China, when these companies earn US dollars through selling us their goods, they take those dollars and they buy bonds. They stick them in savings accounts, right? And remember what we said here? And I'll come back to this, don't worry. We'll come back to this. They buy bonds. And what we said at the beginning here was we had the Federal Reserve. Now we're going to draw a rectangle like this. This is the Fed. Okay. This is China's reserve account. Okay. This is a reserve account. All right. China's got some dollars up here in their reserve account. They want to buy some bonds. All right, they're going to buy some bonds. When they do, the Federal Reserve takes the dollars that were in the reserve accounts that they used to buy those bonds, and they shift them to a savings account where they sit there earning interest. They don't get spent. They sit on a spreadsheet at the Fed, and they go nowhere. Yes, that's right. When China buys a bunch of bonds, the dollars simply shift from a reserve account at the Fed to a securities account at the Fed, and then they sit there. There's your debt. Now, so how do you pay it off? How do you pay off the national debt? Oh, well, the same process, you just reverse it. How do you pay China? Well, you just put the dollars, the Fed just shifts the dollars back to a reserve account. That's it. They shift back and forth. The money's not gone. The Fed just simply lowers the numbers here and raises numbers here with a keyboard. It takes a little keyboard here, types a number, it marks up the accounts here, marks down accounts there. If there was 10,000 here, it marks it down to 0 and marks 10,000 over here. That's it, just shift. There is no national debt because the US government itself is the currency issuer. It issues the dollar that you used to buy the bonds. Huh? Isn't that clever? Isn't that interesting? The US government actually has to actually give you the dollars necessary to buy the damn bonds in the first place. Your private sector, there's no such thing as a private sector dollar. All dollars, as we just discussed, all dollars that exist in the private sector today were put there by the US government through deficit spending. Therefore, if you're going to buy a bond, you got to have the dollar. The government has to give it to you, just like the government has. If you're going to pay the taxes, it has to give you the dollar. If you're going to buy a bond, it has to give you the dollar to buy it. It's really that simple. So then this leads us to conclude that since the government is the sovereign currency issuer that gives you the dollars to buy the bonds, why the hell is it issuing bonds?
Exactly. And Ellis, I just want to ask you point blank, there's two questions that come up. Obviously, people are certainly saying, well, taxes fund deficit spending, taxes fund blah, blah, blah. That's one thing. The next, I know it is nauseating, but I want to try to keep it at 101. Yeah. It's like the hard part for me is you just sat there and went through it, but yet they're here to teach. And this is the problem we have, and this is why it gets dicey sometimes. We're trying to teach here. We're not asking you to teach us, we're teaching you. And Ellis has taken his time to teach you. So the goal here is to not kind of come up with something new to tell us, is to listen. And when you're done and you've gone away and you want to talk with other people, you can sit there and make up stories in fictional ways money works. But in the process, let us teach you about macroeconomic reality. That's number one. Second thing, and this is really important, we get this all the time, and you've heard it before, and I think that some of the new people are really struggling with this, because they hear it from the LOL libertarians and others. What happens if the rest of the world doesn't want our dollar anymore, Ellis? What happens?
So
that's what I'm saying, but go ahead.
I mean, no, really, that's about it. So if they don't want the dollar anymore, if they don't want our US dollars anymore, they're going to stop shipping their products to this country. Okay? So imports will drop. In other words, the current account deficit, which is what this is, when a country imports more than it's exporting, it's running a current account deficit. All that will happen is the current account deficit will evaporate. The US will not be getting the imports, and foreign nations will not be saving in US dollars anymore. So what? Okay, that has nothing to do with the US government's ability to issue infinite amounts of US dollars to address problems in its own domestic economy. And then I thought I saw there was someone, Wade Bickle, while you were talking, his name was Wade, asked what happens when China turns in its bonds or whatnot. First of all, it doesn't do that. I'll explain it one more time, just so we can be clear. What China does is it's not buying bonds, it's putting money in savings accounts that it's earned, okay? And we'll get to why bonds exist in a second. But like I said, the Fed takes the dollars that China uses to buy the bonds and it shifts them to a savings account. It just shifts them from a checking account to a savings account. And then when it comes time to give China its money back, those dollars just sit there in the savings account unspent. The Fed will then just shift them back to China's reserve account. That's it. It just shifts them back. They go from one spreadsheet to another. It's not hard currency. It's not gold coins. It's just numbers on spreadsheets. They stay in a savings account and then they're shifted back from where they came from. So that's all. It's really nothing more complicated than that. So the question becomes, why does the US government issue bonds if it doesn't need them for fiscal policy? Well, the truth is, bonds don't conduct fiscal policy. They don't fund deficit spending. Okay? Bonds are issued by the US government in a fiat regime when the government wants to see a particular target interest rate prevail. That rate is set by the Federal Reserve. It sets a target interest rate, okay, and has to defend it. Now, there are ways that it can do this. It can pay interest on reserve, all right? But let's just focus on the bonds so that we can see why bonds are being issued. The U.S. Treasury will issue bonds, and the Federal Reserve will conduct open market operations to obtain these bonds because Congress will not allow Treasury to sell directly to the Fed. Okay. So, once the Fed gets its hands on the bonds, here's what happens. The Fed sets a target interest rate. And let's say that target interest rate is set at here, call it 1%, all right? Here's the target. There it is. All right. But remember what we talked about deficit spending? When the government is deficit spending, reserves do what? It adds reserves, doesn't it? Remember we talked about we had the squares and we had Steve Grumbine here, we had Chase, and we had Bank of America, and as the government was deficit spending, the numbers were going up in the reserve accounts. When it deficit spends, reserves rise system-wide. They rise in reserve accounts, okay? But when that does that, when reserves rise, okay, this can play havoc with the Federal Reserve's target interest rate, okay? Because when there's excess reserves in the system, the federal funds rate, or what we call the overnight rate, okay, it can put downward pressure. So the overnight rate begins to push down on this target rate and bend it. It's pushing down on that target rate. Okay, and if the Fed doesn't do something, it'll lose control of monetary policy, which is what the Fed conducts. So guess what it does? In order to defend that target rate, it goes into those reserve accounts that we were talking about, and it removes the dollars, the reserves in dollars. You know, it'll remove some, so it's going to remove one there, and it's going to remove one here, and it replaces them with a treasury bond. And that stops the competition. What competition? Competition for excess reserves on the interbank market, on the federal funds market. What happens is when there's excess reserves, some banks, okay, some banks occasionally run short of reserves, all right? Others have a surplus. Well, these banks want to lend their surplus reserves to other banks, not to customers, but to other banks on the interbank market, okay? And that activity, that competition for excess reserves, places that downward pressure, places that pressure on the target interest rate set by the Fed, the overnight rate of the federal funds rate in support. And if the Federal Reserve does not intervene to deal with those excess reserves, the competition will cause the Federal Reserve to lose control of that target interest rate. So the Treasury issues bonds, the Fed, through open market operations, grabs the bonds and then uses them, say, to drain off those excess reserves, halting that competition and bringing everything back in line with that target rate. So in other words, the reason why the federal government issues treasury bonds in a fiat system is because it wishes to see a particular interest rate prevail, the target interest rate prevail. And the Federal Reserve, the central bank, will use those bonds to drain off the excess reserves to defend that target rate, whatever rate the government decides that it wants or is appropriate. That's why it does that. The second reason is corporate welfare. Damn, that was like a slap in the face and came out of nowhere. Corporate welfare. Corporate welfare. But yes, that's the second reason. Corporations use treasury bonds to manage their risks. Instead of their own profits or their own capital, they use treasury bonds to manage their risk. So when the government, pays interest by typing interest into existence at keyboard, corporation gets free money. And I also wanted to point out, you've heard that before, haven't you, Stephen, about the deficit spending crowding out private investment? You heard that before?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. We actually, even though I didn't say it, we actually did describe why it doesn't and why they're wrong. If we go back and look one more time at reserve accounts here, remember we said that federal deficit spending causes reserves to rise? Okay, well, the crowding out nonsense says that, on the one hand, interest rates are pushed upwards when the government deficit spends. And the truth is that deficit spending places downward pressure on interest rates because the reserves are rising, causing competition for excess reserves, and the overnight rate falls. And second of all, you'll see these Austrians and whatnot claim that government borrowing is competing for scarce dollars. What did we just say at the beginning of this program? Dollars are not scarce because what? The government has an infinite issuance capacity. And when it's issuing bonds, it's seeking to defend a particular target interest rate. It's not funding its deficit spending. So it's not competing for anything. So it's not crowding out anything. Because every single dollar that the precious market is using to do its private thing came from the government because the government is allowing the market to do its private thing.
Amen.
The U.S. government funds the U.S. market, not the other way around. The private sector does not fund itself. The U.S. market does not fund itself. The U.S. economy does not fund itself. The U.S. government is the sole funder.
But Ellis, you see Warstall, I think it's Tim Warstall, always comes around and drops his little flakes of nonsense about, well, MMT is okay within the confines of a closed economy. We don't have a closed economy. We have an open economy. Exactly.
We just talked about the dollars are flowing out of the U.S., out of U.S. citizens' hands into foreign hands. That's not very closed. Okay, it's very open. All right, so as they flowed out, okay, and we've covered up why these nations, why these foreign companies and entities are buying treasury bonds so that they can stick their dollars into savings. And then after they've earned investment, after they've earned some interest on that investment, then their dollars are shifted back to reserve account. And these nations like China, Germany, and whatnot, guess what they do? They either spend those dollars in the U.S., creating jobs for U.S. citizens, okay? Or they open factories here, creating jobs. Or they exchange those dollars at their cost for another currency and do business in another nation. Okay? Or they just let them sit there in a reserve account doing nothing. Okay? But that's it. That's the extent of it. All right? So the national debt's BS. There's no debt.
One more question, Ellis, because we're almost up against the 10 o'clock hour here.
Oh, really?
So, yeah, two hours flies when you're having fun, doesn't it?
Maybe we have to do a part two here.
So real quickly, something happened in 1971 that changed the way federal financing happens, period, now. So a lot of stuff that people once knew, a lot of old textbooks, et cetera, taught things a little differently. What happened in 1971 and why does it matter?
Nixon ended the Bretton Woods Accord. He ended the Bretton Woods system for good, intending to bring something else back but never did to replace it. And the reason for that was that Bretton Woods was unsustainable. It just wasn't working. They're having a dollar standard here where the U.S. government would You could sell your gold to the government, U.S. government, and then use that to get dollar reserves, which you could then exchange for your own currency, and then deficit spend for employment. But the only problem is that Bretton Woods forced nations to maintain an exchange parity, a fixed exchange parity. They had to maintain this. And so the central bank was there, standing ready to make sure that the exchange parity never went out of whack. And when a government would try to address domestic unemployment by deficit spending, this would flood foreign exchange markets with its domestic currency. And so the exchange parity would go crazy. And this would cause the central bank to sweep in and mop up all of those dollars that it deficit spent. And unemployment would just rise again. So these nations that had very, very weak trade positions compared to the US or whatnot, always experienced a deflationary bias, or what we call a recessionary bias. And these nations started saying, the hell with it, can't do it, it's unsustainable. And then Japan began to rise as a trading power. US was involved in Vietnam, all sorts of things going on. Gold reserves were being threatened, and you know, Nixon realized that this is unsustainable, we just can't do this no more. And so he brought the system to an end. And when he did that, he turned loose from the United Kingdom, Canada, US, Japan, Australia, Turkey. These nations were all fiat. They're all now free-floating, inconvertible fiat regimes, where the national governments had unlimited capacity to spend dollars into existence, or spend pounds into existence, or spend yen into existence, you know, with these nations' currencies respectively. And ever since then, about 1973 actually, all these nations have been operating on the system that I've just described here so far. We haven't finished though. And every one of these nations has a sovereign currency issuing government. That's Great Britain, yeah, the United Kingdom. The government of the United Kingdom issues pounds the way the US government does, by keystrokes. And it has infinite issuance capacity. It can't run out of pounds. Australia is seeking a surplus. In other words, it's seeking to create high unemployment. but the Australian government itself cannot run out of Australian dollars because that's where they come from. You know, people have said for years, Japan is the walking dead. It's still walking because Japan, the government of Japan issues the yen, not Honda, not some old man in the private sector, but the government of Japan. So there you go.
So just to put a bow on this, the U.S. is not in debt in the sense of what you and I would call debt. Like, oh shit, how am I going to come up with this money to pay these creditors? Oh my God. It's just like these guys have bought a savings account, and with keystrokes, as long as the person entering the keystrokes hasn't broken off all their fingers and the tip of their nose to keystroke things in, we're going to have enough keystrokes to survive, right? All right. Yeah, I wanted to make sure of that.
But, you know, since we're pressing on the hour and you have a meeting and whatnot,
yeah,
we could do part 2 next Sunday and finish this up, and we could do this. This would be actually pretty good because we could pick up where we left off, explaining the sectoral balances, finishing that off about how private debt comes in and how private debt's an alternative to the US dollar. Okay, and that will tie in with what Fidel was talking about. He had a great talk on Tuesday. I just absolutely adored it. It was a wonderful talk where he talked about private debt and productivity to real wages and GDP redistribution. We'll talk about that. Yeah, and we'll tie it all up. And you can use these 2 shows to just and we'll even have time left over. You and I can just sit down and have a random discussion about just current events or whatever you want.
Love
you
it.
know?
Love it.
I think it would be a great idea because, yeah, it's kind of hard to keep people's attention for 8,000 hours and, you know, you have stuff to do. But yeah, we could get this done. We could do this as part 2. I'd do this next Sunday.
Absolutely. All right, Ellis, thank you, sir, as always. Folks, with all this that's going around you, this is ammunition to go out there into the world and defeat ignorance wherever it exists, to shine a light on evil, which is cutting spending, which is harming the poor, which is making our revolution not happen at all. If all you want to do is be angry and shake fists at the sky, you're at the wrong place. We're into solutions here. So with that, Ellis, thank you so much for the time. Folks, thank you for learning this stuff, because my children are literally dependent on each and every one of you learning and unfucking our country. It is that important. So I thank you all for taking the time to be a part of the solution and not part of the problem. So with that, have a great night, everybody. Thank you, Alice, one more time.
Hi, welcome back. So what did you think about part 2? Did it answer any questions you may have had after having watched part 1? Do you have any more questions? Hit us up, in the comment section below. We'll answer anything we possibly can. We'll pass you off to the experts where necessary. Ask the questions. Ask the questions so that you can get the answers, so that you can start going off into the crowds and start having these conversations with people. Because we need you. We need you to help them. We need everyone, as many as we can possibly get our hands on, to understand this stuff so that we can live. Be back next week.